John Penrose.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I start where I left off when this bill hit second reading by saying this is an extremely welcome bill. It does an enormous amount of very important and much needed change, and I continue to support it in principle. The purpose for me getting up today is because I want to move New Clause 31, which is tabled by me but supported by 29 of my parliamentary colleagues. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, those who are familiar with the criminology of the Conservative Parliamentary Party will understand that it does something which is wondrous to behold, which is it unites every single breadth and part of the party behind one central idea, which is the idea of better regulation. And I should pause briefly just to say better regulation as distinct from deregulation. Better regulation is not saying we want to trash standards, it's saying standards of everything from environmental standards to workers' rights all matter. But it does matter as well that governments of any type and stripe make sure that they try to deliver those standards in the cheapest and most efficient and economically logical way possible. That's the difference, which is between deregulation and better regulation. It is about delivering high standards, but delivering them in the most economically sensible way. And that is what New Clause 31 attempts to do. Now, it is worth pointing out that we actually had a regime which worked pretty well for about 5 or 6 years between 2010 and 2016. That regime did something along these lines. It was called one in, one out, and then it was upgraded to one in, two out. And what it basically said was any new piece of legislation, any new piece of regulation had to be costed for the extra cost it was adding on to the British economy. And before it could be introduced, the minister concerned had to find, to begin with, an equally large amount of cost to remove from other regulations elsewhere, and later on twice as much cost to remove from other regulations elsewhere. And that sort of worked, Mr Deputy Speaker. It worked reasonably well, except that it had some holes in it. It had some loopholes deliberately left, partly because it couldn't affect anything that was created in Brussels when we were members of the EU, and also because it didn't cover things like the economic regulators, Ofgem, Ofwat, and so on and so forth. That system changed to what everybody hoped was a better system in 2016, and it turned out to be an absolute, I'm afraid, Mr Deputy Speaker, disaster. Instead of gently but steadily bearing down on the costs of regulation, what happened was we saw a huge ballooning in costs in the first year of the new system, and there was a target of reducing the costs of regulation across the economy of, I think, £8 or £9 billion. What actually happened was that instead of reducing the cost of regulation by £8 or £9 billion, they increased by that amount instead. Now, you would have thought that that would mean that the sky would fall in, that everybody would be absolutely horrified by the notion, and that this place would be up in arms. Not a bit of it. There was zero reaction from any party right the way across this, because it was lacking some crucial points. And the crucial thing it was missing was a proper accountability mechanism. A proper way of making sure that when governments of any kind, as I said, failed to deliver on better regulation principles, failed to deliver on reducing the cost to wealth creation in this country, and inherently, therefore, reducing the rate of growth of this country, reducing the improvements in productivity which we all want to see, when they failed to do that, nothing happened within Parliament. So clearly, we cannot leave things as they stand. And New Clause 31 is an attempt to try and put that right. It does something very, very simple. It comes back to what I have called net zero red tape, which is effectively one in, one out. So the cost of any new pieces of legislation or regulation need to be matched by finding countervailing savings elsewhere. So that is net zero. But it does something else, Mr. Speaker. It says, look, we need to make sure that there is not just a commitment from ministers, but also a legal duty on governments, not just this government, but all future governments, to make sure that everybody who's a minister, when they get out of bed on a Monday morning, they know that they have a legal duty to deliver on this. And that means that if ministers don't deliver on it, they will have broken the law, and breaking the law means you are in breach of the ministerial code, And that is something that this Parliament and all parliaments take very seriously, and it is a far more effective trigger mechanism for ensuring proper accountability and to make sure that this is delivered. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would be the first to admit that this amendment is not perfect. And the reason why it isn't perfect is because the parliamentary clerks quite rightly have said, hang on a second, this bill has a scope, you can't exceed the scope, and therefore what it cannot do, even though I devoutly wish that it could, is it cannot apply those basic principles, which I've just been explaining to the House. It can't apply them across the entire economy. I would that it could. But as it is, it can only apply them to the economic regulators and to anything to do with competition and consumer law. Now, that is a huge step forward because, as I mentioned, the previous regimes all excluded the activities of economic regulators, and we will now enfranchise them were we to pick up this particular new clause. So it is really worth doing, but it is far from perfect because it can't cover the rest of the economy. And so therefore, and incidentally as well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it has to ask the relevant bits of accountancy, the reporting on whether or not the costs have been added or subtracted. All that has to devolve to the Competition and Markets Authority, when in fact there is under the scope of the bill, when in fact there is a perfectly respectable initial grouping already, which does this, the Regulatory Policy Committee, full of clever and well-intentioned people, and I think that the CMA would rather that they didn't have to do this if they could possibly avoid it. They'd rather other people did it. So it is not a perfect amendment, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but it is nonetheless something which takes us a very big step in a much-needed direction, and it establishes an important principle. Now, I should say I'm very, very grateful to my honourable friend, the Minister, who I think mentioned that we've been having some extensive discussions over the course of the weekend in an attempt to try and both lock in these fundamental underlying principles and also to perhaps find ways to broaden them beyond just the scope of this bill. And I'm hoping that he's going in his closing remarks to be able to come up with some comments which may allow me not to press this amendment to a vote. But fundamentally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the crucial things have to be we must make sure that we have proper, independent measurement and reporting and accountability on the costs of new regulations, rather than anything that can be lent on by government. We need to make sure that there are proper consequences for ministers in any government who fail to deliver on trying to reduce those costs. We must also make sure that no government feels like it has a blank cheque on spending other people's money. It is stark, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to examine the differences in the way we approach taxpayer-funded spending versus regulation cost-funded spending. At the moment, if you're a minister or an official and you want to spend taxpayers' money, you have a squillion different hoops that you have to jump through, and rightly so. Lots of controls on that spending, which is undertaken by the Treasury. It's followed up by the Public Accounts Committee, and I can see one of the senior members of that committee here today. And it is highly, highly regulated and controlled, and great attention is paid to that in this chamber. But if you want to spend 5 times, 10 times, 100 times that amount of money through increasing costs to business through regulation, not a peep. There is much, much less attention paid to those ways of spending cash, and that can't be right. Because instead, as everybody here will understand, a pound taken in tax has the same underlying economic impact on the country's rate of growth as a pound taken in extra cost to business. We should be treating them with equal seriousness rather than huge attention being paid to one and blithely, largely ignoring and writing blank cheques for the other. So any regime has to fix that as well. I'm happy to do it.
Very grateful to my friend for giving way. His self-deprecation at the beginning, that is the scope of this amendment, which I have co-signed, I think he's actually underselling the amendment, because I think the consumer protection and economic regulation goes a long way to reducing the burden of red tape. And I think the second thing that's really important about this amendment, it's not to do with the number of amendments, it's to do with the economic value. And that is what really places a burden on business in this country. And can he explain in the amendment how he's going to establish a baseline, because if this thing is to be measured properly, we have to have a proper baseline.
And he's right. I may have been guilty of being too glass half empty rather than glass half full. He is right that this amendment goes a very long way and enfranchises large chunks of the economy which perhaps haven't been dealt with properly up until now. I just wanted to go even further and to cover the entire economy, and he's right to point out that it does quite a lot, but it's maybe half a loaf rather than the whole loaf, if I can put it that way. He's also right to say that the accountancy, the measurement of the costs, is crucial. Not only because you then have to work out, if you're trying to do one in, one out, you have to know what the cost of the things coming in is, so you can know the cost of the savings that you've got to find elsewhere. The crucial thing has to be, as I mentioned before, that you need to have an independent accounting body, an independent measurement body. That will require, I think, the Regulatory Policy Committee to perhaps be made a little bit more independent, to be given more arm's length ability to set the accounting standards, if you like, to set the measurement standards in a way which cannot be lent on by senior ministers, by senior mandarins, by senior regulators, and they can look them square in the eye and say, no, this is the way it's got to be, and like any good external auditor, if you like, they are sufficiently arm's length to be able to deal with that. If they do that properly, then at that point we have something which will mean that any set of measurements can be relied on by both his committee and the rest of this chamber as well, and is absolutely essential. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in just bringing my remarks to a close, that is what we need. We need a system which, if not this amendment, then a system which provides proper accountability for anybody who fails to hit these targets, proper measurement and accounting standards independently to make sure that government and regulators cannot mark its own homework, and proper targets of some kind to make sure that there is a standard or a target to which ministers must be held. I hope that my honourable friend the Minister will be able to reassure me when he gets to his feet, and I look forward to his remarks accordingly.
Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Weston-super-Mare, who I thought made some very, very interesting arguments about that. And I certainly heard echoes in some of the arguments that he's made, and arguments that have been made by the opposition during my few years in this place about trying to measure the effect that legislation actually has as it is passed. And these amendments seeking to do that routinely get knocked down. But I think there is a fundamentally useful point in what he says about the need to be able to make sure that we are not suffering from unintended consequences, and that the goals that we're seeking are indeed the ones that result, so that corrective measures can be taken if they indeed are not. Now, Hansard